The ballroom shimmered beneath a canopy of chandeliers, each crystal catching the light and scattering it like diamonds across the polished marble floor. Music from the string quartet floated in the air, delicate, refined, meant to charm the guests into conversation. Everywhere, people stood in groups, laughing too loudly, raising champagne glasses, whispering about deals and futures. It was the CEO's annual charity gala, the one event that promised to draw the city's most powerful names into one dazzling room. And yet, in the midst of all that glamour, there was one corner that no one dared to approach. She sat there quietly, her hands folded neatly on her lap, the fabric of her soft satin gown pulled carefully around her wheelchair. The CEO's daughter. Only 16, with a face that glowed with a youthful softness, but eyes that carried something heavier, an ache too old for her years. People glanced at her, smiled politely, and then quickly turned away. Some whispered as they passed. Others chose not to look at all, as though acknowledging her presence might expose their own discomfort. "She doesn't really belong here," one woman murmured behind the rim of her champagne flute. "She's only here because of him," another replied, nodding toward the stage where her father stood, commanding attention with every word of his speech. The girl shifted slightly, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders, trying to ignore the sting of their words. She had begged her father to let her come tonight, hoping maybe, just maybe, it would feel different. But it didn't. The gown, the music, the laughter, it was all wasted when she remained invisible in the eyes of everyone else. She glanced at her lap, where her fingers twisted nervously together, and for a moment, she thought about asking to go home. The night felt endless, and her heart ached with the heaviness of being both present and unseen. And then, just as she was about to lower her eyes completely, the doors at the far end of the hall opened with a quiet creak. A man stepped inside, not in the sleek tuxedos that dominated the room, but in a simple, well-worn suit that looked like it had been brushed and pressed with care. His tie was slightly crooked, his shoes shined but scuffed from years of use. He didn't carry the easy arrogance of the other men. Instead, there was something grounding about him, something that felt real. At his side, a little girl clutched his hand tightly, her tiny white dress swishing with each step. She looked around in wide-eyed wonder, delighting at the sight of glittering gowns and the sparkle of chandeliers. Her laughter rang out, unashamed and pure, and for a fleeting moment, it cut through the stiff, calculated conversations around the room. The guests noticed them instantly, and whispers began again. "Who invited him? Do you think he's a business partner? More like he doesn't belong here." The man didn't seem to notice. He bent down to adjust his daughter's dress, whispering something that made her giggle, and when he straightened, his eyes swept across the room. They were steady, searching, not for wealth, not for power, but for something else entirely. It was then that his little girl tugged at his sleeve. She pointed, not at the chandeliers, not at the elegant gowns, but toward the lonely figure in the corner. The CEO's daughter, sitting small in her chair, her eyes hidden behind lowered lashes. The man followed his daughter's finger, and when his gaze landed on the girl in the wheelchair, he didn't look away. He didn't avert his eyes like the others. Something softened in his expression, as though he saw not what she sat in, but who she was. The CEO's daughter, sensing the shift, glanced up. For the first time all evening, she locked eyes with someone who wasn't afraid to meet hers. And though he hadn't spoken yet, though the distance between them was still wide, she felt her chest tighten with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. Something was about to change. The music softened into a slower melody as the string quartet transitioned to another piece, but she barely heard it. Her gaze lingered on the man and his little girl, curiosity warring with the familiar caution that came whenever someone noticed her. People often looked, sometimes out of pity, sometimes out of discomfort, but never like this. His eyes didn't carry pity. They carried a kind of recognition, as if he saw the loneliness she tried so hard to hide. She quickly looked away, ashamed of the hope rising in her chest. It was foolish to think he would cross the room. Men like him, ordinary, grounded, yet confident, never noticed girls like her. They had lives to live, families to protect. She was a complication in a chair. She had learned to accept it. But then, to her shock, he began moving. Step by step, through the clusters of polished men and jeweled women, he walked with his daughter's small hand tucked safely in his own. The little girl's dark curls bounced as she skipped to keep up with his stride, her face beaming as though the entire world were made of joy. The crowd shifted around them, whispers trailing, but neither of them seemed to notice. His eyes never left the girl in the corner. Her heart pounded as he drew closer. She wanted to straighten her dress, smooth her hair, do anything that would make her feel less small. Instead, her hands twisted in her lap, her pulse racing in her ears. When he finally reached her, the room seemed to fall away. He crouched down beside her, lowering himself so their eyes met at the same level. His daughter hovered just behind him, peeking shyly from his shoulder. For a moment, he said nothing, just offered a smile that was warm, unhurried, patient. It wasn't forced, like the polite nods she was used to. It was real. "I noticed you sitting here," he said gently, his voice steady but soft enough that only she could hear. "Everyone else seems too busy staring from afar." His eyes flickered briefly around the room before returning to hers. "But my little princess here has a question for you." The girl's face peeked out more boldly now, her eyes bright with innocence. "Daddy, can she be our date tonight?" The words tumbled out in a rush, sweet and unfiltered. Her throat tightened. She blinked, certain she had misheard. "Me, really?" The word cracked slightly, betraying the disbelief she carried in every bone. The father's smile widened, though his eyes held a seriousness that told her he meant every word. "Of course, you deserve more than to sit in the shadows while the world keeps moving. Don't you think?" He extended his hand, not in pity, not to pull her somewhere she didn't belong, but as an invitation. A choice. Her gaze dropped to that hand, steady and sure. Her own fingers trembled as they hovered above her lap. Around them, silence began to ripple outward, the murmurs of the crowd fading as people noticed what was happening. For once, the whispers weren't about her chair. They were about the audacity of this man, the bravery of this gesture. Her cheeks flushed hot, but not from shame. Something inside her, something she thought had died long ago, began to stir. Hope, a glimmer of belonging. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. The warmth of his touch anchored her. His daughter clapped happily, twirling in a little circle beside them. "Yay, now we all match. Daddy, she's our date." A soft laugh broke from her lips, unexpected and unpracticed, and she realized how long it had been since she'd laughed without caution. She felt the weight of 100 stares pressing on her back, but for once, it didn't matter. The man didn't seem fazed either. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, his voice calm but certain as he said, "You've been waiting long enough for someone to notice. Tonight, let's change that." And for the first time all evening, she didn't feel like the CEO's paralyzed daughter. She felt seen. She felt chosen. She felt like someone worth asking. The first notes of a waltz rippled through the air, filling the ballroom with a rhythm meant for motion. Couples paired off, their gowns swirling like petals across the marble floor, the men leading with practiced ease. She watched them for a moment, her stomach tightening, because the dance floor was a place she had always been forbidden to imagine herself upon. It was a stage for elegance, for grace, the kind she had once dreamed of before the accident, before the chair. But he didn't hesitate. With her hand still resting in his, the man straightened and gently guided her wheelchair forward. The crowd parted as though uncertain whether to stop him or step aside, whispers rising again in disbelief. Yet he moved calmly, as if the stairs were nothing more than shadows. His little girl skipped happily alongside them, her laughter scattering like bells. When they reached the center of the floor, the orchestra swelled, and every eye in the room turned. For a moment she wanted to shrink, to disappear beneath the weight of so many gazes. But then she felt his hand steady on hers, his presence grounded, unshaken. He looked at her, not at the chair, not at the people around them, but directly into her eyes. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice carrying enough for her to hear over the music, yet meant only for her. Her lips parted, trembling with words she didn't know how to speak. "But, I can't." He shook his head gently. "Yes, you can. We'll do it our way." Before she could protest again, his daughter twirled beside them, her little arms stretched out as though she, too, were part of the waltz. The innocence of it broke something inside her, a barrier of doubt she hadn't realized she still carried. Slowly, she allowed herself to breathe. The man began to move with the rhythm, not stepping back to the edges as she feared he might, but staying with her, walking around her chair in a gentle circle as though the wheelchair itself had become part of the dance. His hand never let go of hers, and with each turn, she began to feel the music in her chest, the beat weaving through her veins. For the first time in years, she wasn't just watching life happen. She was part of it. A hush spread through the room. The guests who had once avoided her gaze now couldn't look away. Their expressions shifted, some in wonder, some in shame, some in quiet admiration. Even those who had whispered cruelly before found themselves silenced by the simple beauty of the moment. Her father, standing at the edge of the balcony above, froze mid-sentence as he looked down upon the floor. His daughter, glowing with laughter, her cheeks flushed pink, her eyes alight with something he thought he'd lost forever, hope. And the man beside her, leading with respect, not pity, treating her as though she were the only person in the room. The girl leaned closer, her voice barely audible beneath the music. "Can this night last forever?" He smiled, the corners of his eyes softening. "Not just tonight," he said. "Let's start forever." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but for once, she didn't try to hide them. She let them fall, unashamed, because they weren't born of sadness but of something purer, something long denied, joy. The orchestra played on, but for her, the world had narrowed to three people in the middle of a crowded room: a father, his little girl, and herself. The crowd might forget by tomorrow, the whispers might return, but she knew her heart would never be the same. She wasn't invisible anymore, she wasn't broken, she was chosen, and that was enough to change everything.